Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear students. I cordially welcome you to the new semester. Well, in this semester, I will be teaching you history of English literature from Old Period or Anglo Saxon Period till Romantic times. Okay, since this is an online class, in order to make things easier and more comprehensible for you, I will try to speak as slowly as possible, and I will also be repeating something for the ease of understanding. Okay, so before I begin today's talk, I would like you to have a look at today's lecture. In today's lecture, I will be telling you why and how English literature is divided into different ages and periods. After that, I will be talking about the relationship between history, literature and society. After that, I will be giving you a brief background to Anglo-Saxon or Old English period. I will also be discussing very briefly the political and religious conditions of the time. And of course, I will be telling you that why this period is named as Anglo-Saxon period. And after that, I will be introducing you to Anglo-Saxon literature. We will be discussing the poetry of the times, we will be discussing the prose writers of the time, and then we will conclude. So, let us begin. So, if we look at the history of English literature, then you will see that it is one of the richest literatures of the world. It has got continuity, variety and vitality. It started round about 5th century BC and it has continued till to date. Many writers use it to express their feelings, emotions and ideas in the form of poetry, literature, drama, history, scientific fiction and even child literature. So, it is no doubt the richest literatures of the world, and it has passed through certain definite phases with each with its own prominent and marked characteristics. These phases may be termed as ages or periods and are named after the central literary figures or important rulers of England or certain important historical eras. Now, an interesting question is why any literature or English literature gets divided into periods or histories. Well, if we look at the history of other literatures of the world, then we would see that it is customary, it is very common with the literatures of the world to be divided into different periods or ages, and it is done because for the ease of understanding. I would like to give you the example of Arabic literature. Arabic literature is one of the richest literatures of the world, like English literature, and it is also divided into different periods as Ayyam-e Jahiliya, the literature before the birth of our Prophet, and the literature after the birth of our Prophet Hazrat Muhammad, peace be upon him. Then Umayyad literature, or in Urdu we call it Banu Umayya, and then Abbasid literature, or in Urdu we call Banu Abbas, literature of Banu Abbas. So, it is it is customary to be done so. And why it is done so? Because it is easy to understand. I would like to give the example of books. Books are divided into chapters for the ease of understanding. Chapters in a book may stand alone, but they are also interrelated and interdependent on other chapters. So, same is true of literature and literary periods. One period in history is dependent upon and related to the other period. So, if for example, if we want to understand the literature of Elizabethan times, so it would be great to study the literature of the Elizabethan time by having a close look at the period preceding it and at the period following it. Okay. So, now let us see in how many periods English literature is divided. English literature is divided into certain periods, and this is, for example, the English literature is divided into central periods after the central literary figures. For example, we have ages of Chaucer, we have age of Shakespeare, then we have age of Milton, Dryden's age, Pope's age, Johnson's age, Wordsworth's age, Tennyson, and so on. And sometime the English literature is named after important rulers of England. So, we have Elizabethan age after the name of famous Queen Elizabeth, then we have the Jacobean period, then we have the Queen Anne, and then we have Victorian age, and then we have the Georgian period. English literature is also divided into different phases after certain important historical eras. So, we have the medieval period, we have the Anglo Saxon period and Anglo Norman period. Also, English literature is divided into different periods after certain literary movements. Then we have the classical age, we have the romantic age. Of course, there are other ways of classifying ages. We have the 17th century literature, 18th century literature, 19th century literature, 20th century literature, and so on. So, before I move on, I would like you to keep in mind a very important thing, that there is lot of overlapping between these ages and periods, but they are essential to understand the growth of English literature. Now, the question is, what is the relationship between literature, history, and society? We know literature is a reflection of the society, and if we want to understand literature, it is important to understand the society which gave birth to that literature. We cannot understand, for example, the Jahiliya period or the Jahiliya literature of the pre-Muhammadan times unless we understand the society of those times, which was tribal, illiterate, and nomadic society without any central government. So, it is important to understand the society and the political history of those times if we want to understand the literature of that particular era. So, besides discussing the literature of Anglo Saxon period, I will be discussing the political and cultural history of those times. So, if we look at the pages of history, then we would see that around 1st century BC, Julius Caesar, the famous Roman conqueror, started attacking the territory now called Great Britain and ousted the local population, Celts and Gales, and made England as part of the Roman Empire. Now, in those times, Gaelic and Celtic languages were spoken by the local population, and when Julius Caesar attacked and conquered that territory, the Celtic and Gallic language were replaced by Latin language. Now, Latin language was the language spoken by the Roman population, and you must keep one thing in your mind, that the conqueror imposed their language on the conquered territory. And we have very familiar example from our own area. You know, before the British, Muslims were the rulers in India, and it was their language, Persian language, that got prominent, that got the status of the official language of India. And when the Muslim government, disintegrated, Muslim government was over and British came, they imposed their language, English, in the area. So the language of the rulers replaced the language of the local people. So Roman people brought Latin language. They also brought Christianity, and they built roads and other infrastructure in the world. Another thing we must keep in our minds, that every language leaves its traces on the other languages. So Latin also got influence. It of course influenced the local languages, Celtic and Gaelic, but it also got influenced by these languages. So after the Romans conquered the area, they were also finally ousted by very powerful Germanic tribes, Angles, Saxons and Jutes. And this conquest of the Germanic tribes occurred around 450 BC, and this occupation of the Germanic tribes, Angles, Saxons and Jutes, continued around 1066 BC. So now if we look at the political and religious conditions of the time, then we would see that in those times people lived in the forms of groups or tribes, and there was no concept of central governments. People led a life of nomads. They went from one place to the other, settled there for some time, and then went to other greener places where they could find water or other facilities of life. And of course there were frequent wars, and because of these frequent wars there was a very prominent group of warriors, prominent class of warriors, and one tribe ousted the other. One territory was attacked by another outsider and conquered that tribe, and literacy was also very limited. Very few people learned how to read or writing, and the literature, most of the literature was oral literature. And so far as the religious beliefs of the people were concerned, most of the people were either Christians or pagans, and there were no paper and printing presses in those times. So these were the political and religious conditions when the Anglo Saxons ruled over the area called Great Britain. I would like to tell you a very interesting thing, that in those times names were continuously changing. So the earlier name of England was Brittany. So now the question is, why and how this period is called Anglo Saxon period? Now, unlike the other tribes, Angles and Saxons, who were Germanic tribes who came from southeast of Russia, as Germany was not there as a nation yet. These German speaking tribes brought their own languages. Angles had their own dialect, Saxons and Jutes had their own particular dialects. So, as I said, unlike the other conquerors, Angles and Saxons made England their home, and they are truly ancestors of English race. And amongst these three tribes, Angles and Saxons were the most powerful, and England got her name from the dominant tribe, Angles. These Germanic tribes brought their own language with them and naturally influenced and got influenced by the local languages. So, Alfred the Great was the most prominent of all Anglo-Saxon kings. This is what history tells us. And around 1066, Harold, the last of the Anglo-Saxon kings, got defeated at the Battle of Hastings by William the Conqueror of Normandy, France. So, the rule of Anglo-Saxon period ended in 1066 century. So, we have seen how England got its name and why this period is called Anglo-Saxon period. Thank you very much.